This is the second video of manual transmission. Now we're going to discuss the rear section of the transmission. Now again, rear sections of transmissions vary between models, so you're going to have to make sure you get the right manual when you're looking at the rear section of the transmission. For instance, the picture you see here, we have gears that are helical cut, which means that we use tapered roller bearings. In this picture, we have straight cut gears, so we're going to use straight roller bearings so we don't have to shim the rear housing. In the first picture, we have to shim the rear housing, and there's a specific procedure for going through to make sure you do it so that we have the correct amount of end play on the shafts. If we take a look at beginning of the rear section, so here we have a spacer, a bearing, and a retainer. Now this all is bolted to the front section, and our output shaft from the front sections comes through here. This is the drive gear for the rear section that run onto the two counter shafts. Then we have a washer and a snap ring, and that holds this all onto the front section. Again, you have to look at the manual to see if they do differ. Our counter shafts in the rear section are the same as the front section. They're pressed together. The rear section has to be timed the same as the front section. And here we have tapered roller bearings that fit on, and again, this will have to be shimmed. The one thing that's different is in the rear section we might have a splitter and a high and low range. So how this works, this is the high-low range. It's operated by an air cylinder, and this is our synchronizer. So here we have friction material on the outside of this and the friction material on the inside of this. So it's pretty hard to screw up, but if there's a will, there's a way. So on this one here, the friction material goes against here, and this friction material on this one goes against this one here. Now, one of the things we have to pay attention to on the synchronizer itself is there's 3 pins. There's also in here, there are 3 springs, so that we have to make sure we assemble it properly. So this is our synchronizer. So a complaint might be from a driver is when I go to shift from low range to high range I get grinding, or high range to low range I get grinding. When this happens, we have to change the synchronizer, and they come as a unit. You can pull the back section off, change the synchronizer, and put it back on. Be very careful when we're working with the synchronizer, because in behind this pin there's a spring on each one of these. If we pull this apart, that spring's going to fly out. Now we're going to go through in the shop on how to reset the synchronizer so that they work properly. There's 3 pins that are riveted here, here, and here that go into the front section, but there are 6 holes. So making sure that we get them in the right place when we go to reassemble it. Another type of synchronizer you might see is they use friction discs. Now again, we might run into the same problem when we're with the operator is, you hear some grinding. It means these friction discs are worn out. Now when we're reassembling these, make sure that you lubricate the friction discs as we reassemble them. We don't want to reassemble them dry. And count the discs. Now in the manual it'll tell you, say there's 9 discs in the front, 9 discs on the back. Make sure you use that many, or it just is not going to work right. The other thing we want to check is the teeth here. We want to make sure that on our synchronizers, whether it's the teeth around here or here, that they're not getting worn. If they're too worn, that's an indication that we've been shifting and our synchronizer hasn't been working properly. The other thing we want to take a look at is our synchronizer shift fork and how it's set up. So it's an air cylinder, so it uses the air system at 60 psi roughly, and allows it to shift back and forth. Now, a couple things is we might end up with a leak somewhere coming out of a range valve or the slave valve, or we might get air leaking inside the transmission. So as you pull these apart and take a look, there's O-rings that are built inside here, and these have to be replaced when we're redoing this. Especially if we have air leaking inside the transmission, if we got air constantly coming out of the vent, then it's a good indication that one of these O-rings has failed. So on the output of our synchronizer, so this is all bolted together as a shaft, and that's our output for our yoke. Now, one of the things you might still see is a mechanical speedometer. And so when we put the yoke on and tighten it up, this speedo gear is not splined. It's just held together by the pressure of the nut on the back of this yoke. Nowadays, on the newer ones, we use a tone ring and we use a pulse width. So same thing is, this is not splined. Once we put the yoke on and tighten it up, it tightens this up. Now, if we take a look at how the gear ratio and the power flow flows through an auxiliary section, the gear ratio can be anything again when it comes into the input gear here. So this is the main gear, our two countershaft gears. Our power flow out through low range goes this way. When the sliding collar is moved forward, it engages the front half, and our power flow would be direct. So again, low range through there, power flow goes around through. In high range, and again, same as the front section, these countershafts are still turning. This gear floats on this shaft, so if we're engaged in the front, it's still turning. It's just not engaged, so it's not doing anything. Now, the other thing we want to take a look at is some of our auxiliary sections will have a deep reduction. So again, the transmissions vary so much, we have to make sure that when we're changing transmissions, we put the same type of transmission in. So for instance, in some of the deep reductions, there's a dash gauge that you have to come to complete stop to engage the deep reduction. And then same thing as when you want to disengage it, you have to come to a complete stop. So in this case here, we take a look at the power flow through our deep reduction. And then when we go into low range, it takes it out of the deep reduction and goes here. And then if we go in direct, it's going to take the sliding collar from there and engage it in there. Now, when we have a low range and a high-low range and a splitter, which the splitter is set up to split each gear by half. So we will go, for instance, first low, then we'll split it to first high, then we'll go into second low, split to second high, third low, third high, and so on and so forth. Then once we get through all the gears, then we're going to put it into high range. So if we take a look at this picture here, it's the splitters in low range and low split. Then what happens is we go into low range, high split. So what we're doing is, this is low range, low split, low range, high split. Then we go into high range, low split, and then high range, high split, which is also direct. So using this here with a transmission, we can go from a simple transmission, and we can really have a lot more options for our gear ratios. And again, we're going to be discussing the air system in a future video. So again, we talked earlier about a splash lubrication in the transmissions. Again, most of the newer transmissions will have an oil pump that feeds all these gear sets to make sure they get lubricated. A couple of things we should pay attention to is on the front section. Again, this is an oil reservoir, so as the gears are spinning, it throws the oil up and it fills up this reservoir to feed this bearing that's inside here. On the back of the transmission, because these are lubricated, you got to make sure you put your cover on properly with a gasket to make sure that we don't end up with any issues. Also, these on the back section, these are tapered roller bearings, so there will be a shim that goes in here, and we'll discuss shimming later. We'll do that in class. On the front top cover, again, we have our oil trough to make sure that the section gets fed. On some transmissions, they will use an oil pump assembly on the main shaft, or on the input shaft, because the input shaft is always turning. So they'll have this type of pump that works on an eccentric, moves back and forth, and it will feed all the way through the main shaft. Other types will have a gear that runs off the PTO gear, and it will have a little gear pump inside here. Now, if we have a gear pump and we decide that we're not going to put an oil cooler on to cool the oil, we have to put a jumper line on those, on the inlet and outlet, so that the pump doesn't jam up. Now, when we're working on this pump, there's two little roll pins for keys and a snap ring to hold the gear on. Make sure that we put those in place and they're all there, otherwise the gear will just walk off. Now, when we're doing hydraulics, one of the things that we've discussed too is anytime we have a positive displacement pump, we need a relief valve. So when we're doing the inspection on this, we should be checking the relief valve, make sure the spring's not broken. When we're looking at the oil cooler, on the bottom of the transmission, most of them are marked inlet outlet. And if you take a look, there's 3 bolts on here, and this is for a cover to allow you to bypass the oil for the one that has the pump. If it doesn't have a pump, it's just a cover. Again, inside the cooler, out through the outlet, out through the filter, through the cooler, and returning. And how they're set up. This one, instead of having the pump inside the transmission, it's driven off the lower rear countershaft bearing, or shaft, sorry. And again, it pumps oil and it pumps it into the main gear set to make sure it stays lubricated. When we take a look inside at the pump, this one's driven off the PTO gear here, and here's the shaft on the pump. It also has an inlet screen. The other thing that we're going to see inside the transmission is magnets. There will be 2, maybe 3 magnets depending on the transmission, and anytime we strip transmission apart, we should make sure that we clean these magnets properly so that there's nothing on them when we go to reassemble. Again, proper oil level of a transmission, the proper grade of oil, because some oils will not react very well with synchros, and we could end up with problems. So again, make sure that the oil level's right and the grade and type of oil that we use is correct. So by looking in the service manual, it will tell you. So there's some transmissions that use 50 engine oil. So that's what we want to put in. Again, it all depends. Some of them use 80-90 gear oil or a 75 synthetic. So again, make sure we use the proper grade of oil when filling the transmission.